The morning fog at RAF Kenley clung to the runway like a memory that refused to fade. Cold air hung heavy, tinged with oil, petrol, and the faint metallic sting of war. Beatrice Shilling stood on the tarmac with her leather satchel tucked beneath one arm, her other hand resting lightly on her Norton motorcycle. She was motionless, but her mind spun faster than any propeller in the airfield. At 7:42 a.m., a hurricane roared to life across the dispersal pad. A ground crew member signaled, and the aircraft's engine coughed, then settled into a steady growl. Squadron leader Davies, 24 years old and already a veteran of 41 missions, climbed into the cockpit without a word. She watched him from a distance. He didn't see her. He didn't know that today his aircraft was carrying something new, something unauthorized, something that might kill him or save his life. 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had taught her patience. Engineering didn't reward panic. But this wasn't a lab. This was war. And the last 11 months had proven one thing over and over. The Merlin engine failed under negative G-force. It didn't matter how skilled the pilot was. In a steep dive, the carburetor flooded. The engine died. The Germans didn't have that problem. Their Bf-109 seconds had fuel injection. No flooding, no power loss. In the space of 1.5 seconds, a German pilot could close the distance, fire, and vanish. Beatrice had read the reports. Too many of them. She shifted her weight, glancing at the dispersal hut, then back to the Hurricane. Sergeant William Cooper was finishing his checks beneath the cowling. She trusted Cooper. They had worked in silence this morning, just before dawn. He hadn't asked questions when she showed him the brass washer, just nodded once and reached for his torch. The restrictor was in place now, welded between the fuel pump and carburetor, invisible unless you knew where to look. 60 seconds of work, 6 weeks of calculations, 17 prototypes, and now one chance. The aircraft's canopy closed. Davies gave the ground crew a thumbs up. Chocks pulled. The Hurricane began to roll, gathering speed across the wet runway. Beatrice held her breath as the wheels lifted from the ground, the machine rising into the gray sky like a question hurled into uncertainty. She didn't move until the aircraft banked south and vanished from sight. She pulled the satchel closer, gripping the worn leather handle. Inside were 5 more restrictors. She'd only brought 6. One was now flying over the English Channel, and the others, well, she didn't know yet. That would depend on what happened next. Cooper stepped up beside her. He didn't speak, neither did she. The two of them stood together in the wind, listening to the faint echo of engines fading into the morning mist. Around them the station came to life. Ground crews shouted, fuel trucks moved, mechanics argued over spanners and spark plugs. Normal sounds. But nothing felt normal. Beatrice raised her binoculars and scanned the sky. She found 3 specks moving south, Davies and 2 others. Patrol formation, 15,000 feet and climbing. If they encountered Messerschmitts, Davies would dive. And in that dive, everything she had done would be tested in 1.5 seconds. Her fingers tightened around the binoculars. Her heart pounded, a slow, steady drumbeat. She was an engineer. She believed in numbers, in calculations, in controlled variables. But right now, none of that mattered. All that mattered was whether her math could outrun gravity, bullets, and the brutal chaos of aerial combat. Beatrice hadn't always been surrounded by aircraft, fuel lines, and brass components. Long before the war, before the Royal Aircraft Establishment, before men in uniform dismissed her with a glance, she had been a girl in Hampshire, with dirt under her fingernails and engine grease on her knuckles. The world had called her strange. She called it curiosity. At age 14, while other girls were learning embroidery or preparing for finishing school, Beatrice was taking apart a used Norton motorcycle she had bought with her savings. Her father, a local tradesman with little patience for societal norms, had encouraged her. If you can take it apart and put it back together, it's yours, he'd said, thinking it would keep her busy for a week. She had it reassembled in 3 days, and running perfectly by the 5th, that motorcycle became her classroom. She learned not from textbooks, but from sound and sensation, the subtle shift in pitch when the engine knocked, the vibration in the handlebars that meant a bearing was loose, the drag of the rear wheel when the chain was misaligned. The Norton wasn't just transportation, it was revelation. Speed, precision, pressure, combustion, machines made sense to her in a way people rarely did. At 17, she announced she wanted to study engineering. Her school's headmistress nearly fainted. The career counselor asked if she meant nursing, but Beatrice applied to the University of Manchester anyway. There were 326 students in the mechanical engineering program. Only 2 were women. The other dropped out after the first semester. The lectures were filled with equations and diagrams, heat transfer theory, stress analysis, materials testing. Beatrice absorbed it all. She didn't argue with the boys who snickered behind her in the workshop. She outperformed them. Her designs were cleaner, her measurements exact. When the professors posted results anonymously, her student number was always near the top. But excellence didn't win acceptance. At the job fair, firm after firm smiled politely and suggested she try secretarial work. One recruiter, after seeing her portfolio, asked if she was doing this for a husband's business. She left that interview without a word. She found respite in speed. Brooklands was the only place where no one questioned her competence, because there, only performance mattered. On weekends she raced her Norton on the banked circuit, a blur of red leather and grit. The wind screamed against her helmet. The engine howled beneath her. At 106 miles per hour there was no room for doubt. Only calculation, instinct, and resolve. She earned the Gold Star from the British Motorcycle Racing Club, a badge given only to those who maintained an average speed over 100 miles per hour on the track. Only 3 women in history had done it. She was the second. Racing taught her things no lecture hall could. How engines failed under strain. How air and fuel mixed under sudden throttle. How metal warped under stress. She didn't just understand machines, she felt them. By the time war came to Europe, Beatrice was already working at a small automotive firm designing fuel systems. But war didn't care for petrol engines on quiet country roads. Britain needed aircraft, fast ones. And fast aircraft needed flawless engines. In November 1939, a month after Britain declared war on Germany, Beatrice applied to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Her interview was short, her resume unimpeachable, her test scores unrivaled. The hiring officer reviewed her credentials and said, "You're quite qualified for a woman." She was assigned to the engine department anyway, one of 2 women. The other was a secretary. She was given a desk, a lab coat, and a stack of engine test results. Most of the men ignored her, a few resented her. One told her flatly, "You'll be married or pregnant before you finish your first project." Beatrice looked him in the eye and replied, "That'll be difficult. I'm already faster than you." She didn't need their approval. What she needed was access to engines, to data, to test benches. She worked through lunch breaks, stayed late, volunteered for the dull jobs, the dangerous jobs, the ones no one else wanted. Fuel mixture evaluations at high altitude. Carburetor calibration under rapid pressure change. She thrived in complexity. She didn't just test parts. She understood why they failed. Her mentor, a retired engineer with 30 years in aero engines, once told her, "You don't think like an engineer, Shilling. You think like the machine." Beatrice took it as the highest compliment she'd ever received. When the Merlin engine began experiencing unexplained failures under combat conditions, the reports trickled into the Ray. Engines dying mid-dive, pilots not returning. Beatrice asked to see the carburetor logs. The lead investigator told her not to waste her time. "It's a fuel issue, not your department." She reviewed the data anyway. Patterns emerged. Failure during -G, instant drop in pressure, carburetor flooding. Every time the same result, 1.5 seconds of silence at the worst possible moment. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't pilot error. It was physics, and it was killing her pilots. That was the moment it became personal. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were young men with lives, with mothers, with stories. Some of them had written desperate margin notes on their maintenance forms. Happened again during pursuit. Engine died. Nearly didn't recover. Fix this. No one else was fixing it. So she would. By the summer of 1940, the war had devoured England's skies. Airfields that once echoed with the laughter of young pilots now hummed with tension and loss. Beatrice spent her mornings reading combat reports, her afternoons buried in test data, and her nights staring at diagrams that refused to offer answers. Every line of text, every number on a chart, represented another man who hadn't come back. The Merlin engine was a masterpiece of design, but it had one fatal flaw: it didn't understand gravity. Under -G, fuel surged away from the jets, flooding the float chamber. The engine stalled for 1.5 seconds. In a laboratory, that was a minor inconvenience. In combat, it was a death sentence. The Luftwaffe pilots knew. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could dive straight down without losing power, thanks to its fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine. British pilots couldn't. Every time a Spitfire or Hurricane tried to follow a German fighter into a dive, the engine died. 1.5 seconds later, the German was behind them, firing. Beatrice read the phrasing that repeated itself through every debrief: engine failure during pursuit. Lost power under -G. Pilot killed in action. The words were cold, bureaucratic, efficient, just like the machine that had failed them. She asked for full access to the carburetor test logs. The senior engineers hesitated. "It's already being handled," they told her. "Rolls-Royce is developing a pressure carburetor. 2 years, maybe 3. We'll get there." Beatrice stared at them. "In 3 years," she said, "there'll be no one left to use it." The Royal Aircraft establishment had become a fortress of silence. The men around her spoke in numbers and equations, but none of them looked at the photographs. Beatrice did. She saw faces. 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds, boys with smiles so open they could break your heart. One, a pilot named Ashton, had left a note on his last maintenance form: "If this happens again, I won't make it home." The next report listed him as missing in action. She folded the paper in half and slipped it into her notebook. It stayed there for the rest of the war. One afternoon, she attended a meeting in the engine department's conference room, a narrow, smoke-filled space with a long oak table. Charts and test results littered the surface. A senior engineer was presenting the latest data, a string of graphs showing airflow disruptions and pressure drops. "The issue is intermittent," he said, "and we have not yet identified a field-ready modification." Beatrice raised her hand. "It's not intermittent," she said. "It's consistent under -G. Every report, every failure, same conditions." The engineer frowned. "Miss Shilling, with respect, these are complex mechanical systems." "Complex," she cut in, "but not mysterious. The carburetor design was built for steady flight, not combat dives. When the aircraft inverts, fuel floods the float chamber. It's physics, not luck." A few heads turned. One of the younger men, a new hire, looked at her with quiet admiration. The department head, however, adjusted his glasses and said, "Thank you, Miss Shilling. We'll note your comments." That meant sit down. She did, but her jaw tightened. Outside, through the narrow window, she could see contrails in the distant sky, thin white scars marking another dogfight somewhere over the channel. The sound of engines echoed faintly, muffled by clouds and distance. Somewhere up there, another pilot was trusting an engine that wasn't trustworthy. The next week brought a courier envelope from RAF North Weald. Inside were carburetor fragments recovered from a downed Hurricane. The parts were twisted, blackened by fire. Beatrice laid them out on her bench one by one, the smell of burnt metal still clinging to them. The float had cracked. The valve seat was warped. She ran her finger over the scorched edge of the chamber and whispered to herself, "He never had a chance." She stayed late that night. The lab was quiet except for the faint tick of cooling metal and the hum of the overhead lights. On the wall above her bench hung a photograph of her Norton racer, taken before the war. In that image, she was smiling, helmet tilted, grease on her cheek. It felt like another lifetime. Back then, engines were freedom. Now they were responsibility. She turned the carburetor piece over in her hands and realized that if no one else would fix this, she would. Weeks turned into months. She collected every piece of data she could find: flow charts, altitude tests, acceleration records. The engineers at Rolls-Royce continued to pursue the long-term solution, the pressure carburetor. But Beatrice wanted a solution now. Something field-ready. Something small, simple, elegant. Something a ground crew could install in minutes. She began building models in secret: brass washers, thimbles, restrictors of varying diameters. Her lab notebook filled with calculations. She tested each one on a bench-mounted Merlin, simulating -G by inverting the unit and adjusting the fuel pressure. Most tests failed, some catastrophically. The float jammed, the engine coughed, sputtered, died. But with each failure she learned. The goal wasn't to eliminate the flood entirely, it was to control it. To let just enough fuel through to keep the engine alive until gravity returned. When the test engine finally ran clean through a full -G simulation, Beatrice didn't cheer. She didn't even smile. She simply switched off the ignition, leaned against the bench, and let the silence wash over her. The solution wasn't glamorous. It wasn't revolutionary. It was a tiny brass washer with a precisely calculated hole in the center. It could be manufactured for less than 50 cents, and it could save lives. She scribbled the final notes in her log, turned off the lights, and locked the lab door. Outside, the night air was cold, sharp, and smelling faintly of rain. Somewhere to the south, lightning flickered above the channel, and the distant rumble of engines carried through the dark. She started her Norton motorcycle and drove into the wind. The road was slick, the air biting, but her thoughts were clear. The war wasn't just being fought in the sky, it was being fought in workshops, in mines, in the quiet defiance of people who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. The idea came to her not with thunder, but with silence. It was a late January evening, wind howling through the old glass panes of the Ray workshop, when the thought first coalesced. Beatrice sat alone at her bench, surrounded by parts, coffee-stained papers, and a Merlin carburetor dissected into 32 components. The problem had been poking at her from the edge of consciousness for weeks. Now, staring at the empty fuel line in her hands, she stopped moving. What if the solution wasn't to redesign the carburetor? What if it was to limit the flood? Not block it. That would starve the engine. Not reroute it. That would take time, space, new parts, and authorization. No, it had to be something simple. Something so stupidly simple that it would embarrass the entire department if it worked. A restrictor, a washer, a disc that narrowed the fuel flow, just enough to prevent overwhelming the float chamber during a negative G dive. She didn't move for a full minute. The wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed. Then she stood up. By midnight, the first prototype had taken shape, a brass washer, no bigger than a sixpence, with a precisely drilled hole in its center. She worked the drill press herself, measuring and re-measuring, hands steady even as exhaustion crept up her spine. The first hole was too wide, the second too narrow. By the fifth attempt, she'd found a diameter that made sense, 0.04 inches. Not enough to choke the fuel supply, but just enough to slow the surge under inversion. The next 3 nights blurred together. She tested 17 variants on the bench engine, modifying pressure settings to simulate the conditions of a dive. Some ran smooth for a few seconds, then sputtered. Others choked immediately. One blew the carburetor apart with a pop so loud it brought a maintenance worker running. She waved him off with a tired smile, soot on her face, adrenaline in her blood. She barely ate. She slept in her coat in the corner of the lab, waking when the temperature dropped low enough to make her shiver. She washed her hands in the sink behind the parts cabinet. No one stopped her. No one else was willing to touch the problem anymore. Late one night, around 3 a.m., she walked outside to clear her head. The frost had turned every surface to glass. Her breath rose in clouds. She sat on her Norton and leaned forward, closing her eyes. The engine wasn't running, but in her mind, she could hear it. The high-pitched whine at 7,000 revolutions per minute, the subtle knock just before over-revving. She remembered Brooklyn's. The feeling of speed, the fear, the calculation. Machines, like people, only broke under pressure. But unlike people, they told you why. She opened her eyes and went back inside. On the 6th night, she inserted a washer, started the test engine, and inverted the fuel line to simulate a dive. The engine kept running. 1 second, 2, 3, full throttle, no sputter. She shut it down and sat back in her chair, hands folded on her lap, staring at the machine. She didn't smile. Not yet. She'd been fooled before. But she felt something, a quiet shift in the air, like the moment a storm decides whether to break or pass. Then came the question, what next? The restrictor worked in a lab, but combat wasn't a lab. There were no tidy test benches at 15,000 feet, no controlled temperatures, no second chances. If the washer failed during a dive, the pilot would die. If it clogged, it might starve the engine. If it cracked, it might do nothing at all. Worse, if the Air Ministry found out she was modifying engines without permission, she could lose her post. Maybe worse, but if she waited for official approval, more men would die. She walked back to her bench and turned off the lights. The following morning, she drew a detailed sketch of the restrictor, adding precise tolerances and installation instructions. Then she reworked the design into a flat washer instead of the thimble shape. Easier to cut, easier to install, less risk of improper alignment. She labeled the document field Mod 1 and locked it in her drawer. Over the next week, she fabricated 6 restrictors by hand, checking each one under a magnifier. She boxed them in cotton-lined tins and tucked them into her satchel. Then she cleaned her bench, filed the paperwork as routine fuel flow study, and made arrangements for leave, unofficial leave. She packed light, her tools, the restrictors, her notes, and checked her motorcycle. The Norton still purred like it did at Brooklyn's. She tuned the throttle cable, tightened the chain, and changed the oil. On the morning of March 14th, she strapped the satchel to the rear pannier and rode south toward RAF Kenley. The airfield was familiar. She'd been there before, back when she was just another visiting engineer. Listened to politely, ignored immediately. But today, she wasn't here for consultation. She was here for war. Cooper greeted her at the dispersal area. He didn't ask why she was there, just looked at the satchel and raised an eyebrow. "I need a favor," she said. He nodded once. They met in a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the officers. She unwrapped one of the restrictors and held it out in her palm. "It's a washer," Cooper said. "It's the only reason we haven't lost another 20 pilots," she replied. "I need you to install it. 1 aircraft, 1 test." He looked at the part, then at her. "Does it work? In the lab and in the sky." "That's what we're about to find out." He took the washer. "Which bird?" She pointed. "Squadron Leader Davies. He's flying this morning." Cooper didn't hesitate. He grabbed his toolkit and walked toward the Hurricane, warming up on the pad. Beatrice followed at a distance, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't believe in superstition, but she murmured a silent prayer to the machine, to the gears and pressure, the torque and fuel, that it would not betray her. Cooper worked quickly. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor, slid the washer into place, and sealed it with a precise weld from his butane torch. 60 seconds. That was all it took. When he stepped back, Beatrice examined the weld. It was clean, invisible, untraceable. No one would know it was there. No one except her. And soon, perhaps, the man who would fly with it. The Hurricane's engine came to life with a deep mechanical growl, the Merlin snarling like a caged animal itching for release. Cooper stepped back from the aircraft as the propeller blades blurred into motion. Squadron Leader Davies moved with practiced ease, helmet on, goggles adjusted, gloves tugged tight, as if it were just another patrol. For him it probably was, but for Beatrice it was a trial. She stood near the dispersal hut, arms crossed over her chest, the satchel still clutched in one hand. She didn't need to see the restrictor to feel its weight pressing on her conscience. It was a simple washer, a 50-cent brass circle, and yet it carried more pressure than any part she had ever designed. Davies gave the signal. The chocks were pulled. The Hurricane taxied forward. Beatrice's heart pounded. The aircraft rolled steadily, picking up speed, the roar of the Merlin rising in pitch. The wheels lifted, and then it was airborne, off the ground, slicing through the low-hanging mist like a sharpened blade. She kept her eyes locked on the dark silhouette until it disappeared into the horizon. Cooper stood beside her, arms at his sides. Neither of them spoke. All around them, the base hummed with the normal rhythm of war. Fuel trucks rumbled. Ground crew shouted to each other over the din of idling engines. Mechanics inspected landing gear. But to Beatrice, the sounds were distant, muffled, as if the world had taken one step back, waiting. 15 minutes passed. She raised her binoculars and scanned the sky. There, 3 Hurricanes, climbing in formation. Standard patrol triangle. Davies was leading. They banked southeast toward Dungeness, a hotbed for German fighters. She tried to quiet her thoughts, but they churned beneath the surface. Would the restrictor hold? Would the weld survive the vibration? What if the hole was too small and starved the engine at full throttle? What if it flooded anyway, and Davies never came back? She had no authorizations, no backup plan, no documentation. She had trusted math, trusted her gut, trusted physics to save a man from bullets. 1.5 seconds. That's all it took to die. The clouds above thickened, the sun casting ghostly shadows on the tarmac. Beatrice turned toward the control tower. The radio operator sat at his desk, headphones on, tapping ash from his cigarette into a tray. His face betrayed nothing. 25 minutes passed. She moved toward the edge of the dispersal area, closer to where the returning aircraft would appear. Her boots crunched on gravel. Cooper followed, silent. His presence was steadying, like ballast in a storm. He'd installed the restrictor. He knew what was at stake. 35 minutes, still no radio call, no update, no news. The knot in her chest tightened. She thought about the photograph in her lab, the Norton, the speed, the joy. She had once believed engineering was about precision, about understanding the elegant logic of machines. Now she knew it was also about responsibility, about what happened when a machine failed and someone else paid the price. 40 minutes, then the radio crackled. Kenley Tower, red section inbound. 3 aircraft, returning from patrol. ETA 2 minutes. Beatrice's knees almost buckled. She raised the binoculars again. There. 3 black dots high in the sky, growing larger. Intact. Engines running. She exhaled slowly. The Hurricanes descended in formation, dropping toward the airfield in wide spirals. Davies landed first. The wheels hit the runway with a soft thump. He taxied toward dispersal, guiding the aircraft into place with quiet confidence. The canopy slid back. He climbed out. Beatrice's pulse surged. His face was calm, relaxed. Then a smile. Not the tight, forced smile of a pilot who had merely survived, but a genuine one. Wide, honest, almost boyish. Cooper grinned beside her. Well, I'll be damned. They moved toward the aircraft. Beatrice tried to suppress the emotion swelling in her chest, but it was useless. She felt her hands shaking. Not from fear, but from relief. The engine had lived, and so had Davies. Davies pulled off his gloves and helmet, running a hand through damp, wind-blown hair. Beatrice approached slowly, uncertain whether to speak. But before she could open her mouth, he looked directly at her, then at Cooper, and said, "Best the Merlin's ever run." The words hit like a punch to the chest, not from pain but from release. Beatrice blinked, her body suddenly aware of its own tension, the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Negative G dive?" Cooper asked cautiously. Davies nodded, still catching his breath. "Over Dungeness, 2 Messerschmitts at 14,000 feet. We had the altitude. I pushed into a steep dive, straight down." He made a sharp slicing motion with his hand. 400 miles per hour. Harness nearly lifted me off the seat. I braced for the cough. The stall. It never came. Beatrice's voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. "What happened next?" "I caught the tail of the second one, got within 200 yards before he saw me, fired a 3-second burst, scored hits on his wing route. He rolled hard and broke for France. I pulled up, engine still at full power, no cutout, no hesitation, like it was made for it." Beatrice swallowed hard. She glanced at Cooper. His grin was now a full-blown smirk. Davies looked between them. "All right," he said slowly. "What did you two do to my aircraft?" Cooper opened his mouth, but Beatrice raised a hand. She owed him the truth. "It's a restrictor," she said, "a brass washer inserted between the fuel pump and the carburetor. Limits fuel flow just enough to prevent flooding during negative G." Davies stared at her. 5 seconds passed. Then he laughed, short, loud, and genuine. "You mean to tell me all it took was a washer?" She nodded. He shook his head in disbelief. "You've got engineers in London redesigning the entire fuel system, and you fix it with a bloody coin-sized washer?" "It's temporary," Beatrice said quickly. "There's still a pressure carburetor in development." "To hell with development," Davies interrupted. "That washer saved my life. Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station." She hesitated. "It's not authorized. If the Air Ministry, if the brass want to court-martial me," he said, "they can do it after the war. Right now my pilots need engines that don't kill them mid-fight." His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the sharpness of command. Not just a request, but a resolution. He turned to Cooper. "You can install more of them?" Cooper nodded. "I've seen it done." "Then do it. Start with red section. I want 4 more aircraft, ready by tomorrow." He paused, then looked back at Beatrice. "And you've just saved lives today, probably mine. Don't keep that to yourself." She felt something stir in her chest. Not pride, not yet. Just a sense of weight shifting, of something finally clicking into place. That evening, while the sun dipped behind a line of clouds and the last flights returned, Cooper and Beatrice worked side by side in the hangar. She handed him each washer from her satchel, and he installed them with precision and care. Each one took 12 minutes. Disconnect the line, insert the washer, seal with the torch. Check for leaks. No fanfare, no applause. Just the clean, quiet rhythm of tools, metal, and trust. By the time they finished, 5 aircraft were ready, 5 machines that no longer carried the same silent flaw. Beatrice watched as one of the young pilots, no older than 19, climbed into his newly modified Hurricane. He smiled at her as he walked past, oblivious to what had changed inside his engine. She didn't need him to know. Not yet, but maybe one day he'd get back from a dive that should have killed him and wonder why the engine hadn't failed. Maybe one day someone would tell him about a woman with grease on her hands and stubbornness in her bones who built salvation out of brass and defiance. And maybe, just maybe, he'd live long enough to tell someone else. Over the next 3 days, 5 more Hurricanes flew combat patrols with Beatrice's restrictors installed. Not a single engine failed. Not one. 12 diving attacks were pressed over the English Channel. Every pilot returned. Every Merlin ran clean. By the 4th day, word had spread through the airfield like fire through dry grass. Pilots who had once accepted engine cutouts as a grim reality were now demanding to fly the modified aircraft. Ground crews swapped stories between hangars. Davies dove at 400. No stall. Red 3 got both Messerschmitts. Engine ran like it was born inverted. The base mechanic who had dismissed Beatrice as just a woman now stood by silently as she explained the installation process to a group of technicians. His arms were folded, jaw tight, but he listened. Cooper became her shadow, her right hand. While she prepped the washers, he briefed teams on proper welding technique. The two of them moved between aircraft like battlefield medics, calm, precise, efficient. Each washer installed was another pilot protected, another flight that wouldn't end in silence. On the 5th day, Squadron Leader Davies called her into the dispersal hut. The room was quiet when she entered. 5 pilots stood by the chalkboard, still in flight gear, eyes on her. Davies didn't waste time. "Miss Shilling," he said, "every man here has flown with the restrictor. They all want it permanently installed." Beatrice glanced around. Some of these faces were unfamiliar, fresh replacements from other squadrons. But their expressions were the same, tired, focused, hopeful. Davies continued, "We've lost 19 men in the last 6 months to engine failures. If this washer keeps the Merlin breathing through a dive, then we want every aircraft fitted, immediately." She hesitated. "It's not officially sanctioned. I have no authority to authorize a station-wide modification. We're not asking permission," Davies said quietly. "We're asking for survival." The youngest pilot in the room, barely 20, his cheeks still ruddy from cold wind, spoke up. "I have a brother training in Canada. I want him to come home to an air force that doesn't kill its own." Beatrice nodded. That afternoon, she and Cooper worked 12 hours straight. They installed restrictors in 21 Hurricanes. The hangar was a furnace of noise and motion, torches hissing, metal clinking, men shouting for spanners and sockets. Beatrice moved like she was racing a clock only she could hear. Her fingers were blistered, her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. That night, while she soaked her hands in cold water behind the hangar, the base radio operator handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a message from RAF Tangmere. "Unconfirmed report of field modification improving Merlin under -G. Request confirmation. Request site visit. Request copies of design if available. Urgent." Beneath that, a second message from RAF Biggin Hill. "Need you at station. 32 Spits, 21 Hurricanes, 4 squadrons. Dive failures still occurring. If you have a solution, bring it. Now." She stared at the messages, fingers dripping water onto the ink. Cooper appeared behind her. "Problem?" "No," she said. "Opportunity." By the end of the week, 14 RAF stations had sent requests. The Air Ministry hadn't authorized her, but they hadn't stopped her either. And now they couldn't. She called in 3 engineers from Farnborough, men she trusted, gave them a crash course in the restrictor's function, tolerances, and installation, supplied them with sketches, field notes, and the last of her hand-machined washers. Rolls-Royce couldn't manufacture quickly enough. For now, everything was built by hand in the Ray shop. Each restrictor was stamped with the initials BS. Beatrice Shilling. At Biggin Hill, she met Group Captain Grice on the tarmac at dawn. He had lost 7 pilots in 8 weeks. He didn't ask for proof. He simply asked how many washers she had. 18. Install them all. The next 3 days were a blur. Pilots watched every install with hawk eyes. Some asked questions, others simply stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, an engineering graduate from Cambridge, with 41 combat missions, leaned over as she checked a weld and said, "Brilliant simplicity, Miss Shilling. I wish I'd thought of it." She didn't reply. There wasn't time. The war wasn't slowing down, and neither could she. When the 50th restrictor was installed at North Weald, a young sergeant scribbled on the whiteboard in the maintenance hangar, "Shilling's Orifice installed, ready for hell." The name stuck. At first it was just among ground crews, a bit of crude humor, RAF style, gallows wit to break the tension. But within a week, pilots were requesting it by name. Has this bird got Shilling's Orifice? If not, I'm not flying it. Even Sir Stanley Hooker, head of Rolls-Royce's supercharger division, picked up the nickname. When she heard it, Beatrice raised an eyebrow, then smiled. If it keeps them alive, she said, they can call it whatever they want. By early April, every squadron in 11 Group was either installing or requesting restrictors. Combat reports began to shift. British fighters no longer broke off dives, kill ratios improved, confidence returned. She didn't hold press conferences, she didn't ask for medals. She just loaded her Norton with tools and brass washers, and rode to the next station. The men fought in the sky, she fought on the ground, and now they were starting to win. By April 10th, the data was undeniable. Before the restrictor, engine failures occurred in 38% of all diving attacks against German aircraft. Afterward, that number dropped to less than 0.5%. British pilots were not only surviving dives, they were winning them. Combat reports told the story in cold, clear language: successful pursuit, kills confirmed, enemy driven off. But what the reports didn't say, what they couldn't say, was how the mood on the airfields had shifted. Pilots who once climbed into cockpits with a silent question, "Will the engine hold?" now did so with steel in their eyes. Fighter Command tracked every metric. In March, 47 British fighters had been lost in combat. The Luftwaffe lost 61 aircraft, kill-to-loss ratio 1.3 to 1. In April, the numbers flipped. 29 British aircraft downed, 94 German fighters destroyed, ratio 3.2 to 1. It wasn't only tactics or weather. It was trust. Trust in the engine, in the machine, in the engineering. At 11 Group headquarters, squadron leaders began requesting pre-fitted restrictors for incoming replacement aircraft. The pressure carburetor remained in development, but more than one commanding officer asked the unthinkable, do we still need it? At RAF Duxford, Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the most respected pilots in Fighter Command, reported a series of kills achieved during steep dives. In a letter to his superior, he wrote, "The Merlin now sings through every maneuver. We no longer hesitate. We no longer die." Meanwhile, Beatrice hadn't slowed. She was at RAF Hornchurch overseeing installation number 212 when a black staff car pulled onto the airstrip. A man in a dark uniform stepped out and approached her with an envelope bearing the Air Ministry seal. She read the contents twice. It was a summons. She was to appear at the Ministry's Engineering Review Board in London to discuss unauthorized field modifications and their impact on ongoing engine design strategy. That night, she returned to Farnborough for the first time in weeks. Her lab smelled like dust and disuse. The tea kettle still sat on the corner, cold and forgotten. She unpacked her notes, reviewed the original tests, and prepared for war. The hearing was held in a high-ceilinged room that smelled faintly of chalk and leather-bound books. The panel consisted of 6 men, senior engineers, defense officials, one representative from Rolls-Royce. None of them had flown a Spitfire. None had installed a restrictor. All of them wore crisp suits and unreadable expressions. The chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Shilling, thank you for coming. We understand you have been implementing an unapproved modification to critical aircraft systems." Beatrice met his gaze. "Yes." "Without authorization?" "Correct. With what intent? To save pilots." A murmur rustled through the panel. One of the Rolls-Royce engineers leaned forward. "You realize this could be interpreted as insubordination. Modifications without oversight risk undermining the integrity of our broader development strategy." Beatrice didn't flinch. "With respect, gentlemen, while your strategy was being developed, pilots were dying." Another panelist adjusted his glasses. "But the restrictor is not a long-term solution. It is a patch." "Yes," Beatrice said, "a patch that works. Right now. On the front line." The tension in the room thickened. A younger man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Miss Shilling, I've reviewed your technical notes. The restrictor appears effective, but it's, pardon me, surprisingly simple. That alone gives some of us pause." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "Do you prefer a complex failure to a simple success?" That silenced the room. She stood, opened her satchel, removed a restrictor. It caught the light, just a brass washer, smaller than a coin. She placed it on the table before them like a chess piece. This has been installed in over 200 aircraft. Every one of them has returned from dives that would have killed their pilots a month ago." The chairman frowned. "And yet no formal testing under our procedures has been conducted. How can we guarantee uniformity, durability, safety?" "By listening to the pilots," Beatrice said. "Ask the ones who came home." Silence again. Then the Rolls-Royce man spoke, this time softer. "Do you know what they're calling it?" "I've heard Miss Shilling's Orifice." Beatrice nodded. "Crude humor, but effective branding." A few stifled chuckles. Even the chairman allowed a thin smile. He leaned back. "Miss Shilling, your actions technically violated procedure, but your results are indisputable. The Air Ministry has decided to retroactively authorize the restrictor and fast-track its manufacture under government supervision." Beatrice exhaled. It wasn't victory, but it was validation. As she gathered her notes, one of the younger engineers lingered behind. He waited until the room had emptied, then approached her. "My brother flew with 43 Squadron," he said quietly. "He didn't come back from a dive last February." Beatrice looked up. "I wish we'd had this then," he said. "Thank you." She said nothing, just nodded. Once, when she left the building, the spring rain had begun. She tilted her head up and let it hit her face. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have to rush. The road ahead was still hard, but now was paved with belief. That afternoon, she sent word to her field teams, full speed ahead. Rolls-Royce would begin production within days. The new mandate authorized installations at every operational squadron. No more secrecy, no more quiet miracles, just engineering, done right. Victory didn't bring rest. It never does, not for those who win by working in the shadows. Even as Miss Shilling's Orifice became standard equipment across every fighter station in Britain, Beatrice returned to Farnborough with little fanfare. There was no parade, no medal pinned to her chest, just her lab bench, her notebooks, and the next problem waiting on her desk, and there were always problems. In late 1941, reports arrived from Murmansk, where British Spitfires operated alongside the Soviet Air Force. Temperatures plunged to 40 below, engine oil thickened into sludge, batteries froze, fuel lines cracked like glass. The Merlin engines, designed for the damp chill of England, were dying before they ever left the ground. Beatrice was assigned to lead the cold weather systems task force. She studied Russian climate data, shipping logs, and engine failure charts. Then she packed her satchel, boarded a military transport, and flew north. At Murmansk, she worked side by side with Soviet mechanics in freezing hangars lit by kerosene lanterns. She modified preheat protocols, introduced oil warmers scavenged from decommissioned bombers, and developed a field start procedure that relied on minimal electrical draw. Within 3 weeks, Spitfires were flying again. One Russian crew chief called her the Frost Witch, not with fear but with reverence. She stayed just long enough to write a 37-page report, then flew back home, frost still clinging to the lining of her coat. From there, it was on to the next crisis. The Merlin was now flying at altitudes above 35,000 feet. Thin air, low oxygen, unstable fuel mixtures. Engines were overheating or choking. Beatrice collaborated with supercharger specialists and fuel systems engineers to recalibrate mixture settings across multiple altitudes. She didn't just solve problems. She anticipated them. Every fix carried fingerprints of her motorcycle days, small adjustments, intuitive tuning, mechanical empathy. She didn't need machines to speak. She already understood what they were trying to say. Meanwhile, back at Farnborough, the war machine moved without pause. Beatrice was offered a promotion to administrative management. She turned it down. "I'm not made for meetings," she said. "I'm made for engines." She remained a principal technical officer, one of the highest-ranking women in the RAE, but never climbed higher. The director's chair was reserved for men. She didn't protest. She simply kept working. Her marriage, too, was quiet and resolute. George Naylor, an aerodynamicist from Farnborough, had proposed in 1938. They were married just before the war. When the bombs fell over London and the boys went off to fight, George volunteered for Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters, 31 missions over Germany. Statistically, he shouldn't have returned. Beatrice knew the numbers 1 and 2 bomber crewmen never came home. She didn't write him long letters, just diagrams, ideas, puzzles. He wrote back with sketches of wings, airflow tests, the occasional dry joke about engine rattle mid-run. They never spoke about the things they feared. They didn't need to. He returned in 1944, quiet and leaner than when he left. She met him at the station without tears or grand gestures. They walked home side by side, holding hands. They never discussed what he'd seen. He never asked about what she had done. It was enough to know they were still both here. After the war, the Ray shifted focus from survival to progress. Jet engines, missile systems, aerodynamics. Beatrice joined the Blue Streak missile program, developing fuel delivery mechanisms capable of functioning in near-space conditions. She also conducted research on wet runway braking, studying how water impacted aircraft landing at high speed. By the 1950s, more pilots died from landing accidents than combat. Her work reduced that number measurably. She wrote technical papers, dozens of them. Most were read by a handful of engineers, filed into archives, cited in the margins of design memos. Quiet knowledge, quiet impact. At one point, the RAF Olympic bobsled team approached the RAE for help with sled design. It was a strange request, but bobsledding, it turned out, was a question of aerodynamics, friction, and balance. Beatrice smiled. "I know something about friction," she said. She designed their sled herself. They didn't win gold, but they didn't crash either. She still rode her Norton on weekends, restored and tuned to the millimeter. Sometimes she took it to country roads and let it rip through turns at impossible angles just to feel the pull of physics against her body. Sometimes she just sat beside it in the garage, sipping tea and watching the engine cool, the way some people watch the sea. She never bragged. She never sought attention. Most people she worked with didn't know that Miss Shilling's Orifice had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives. It didn't matter to her. She wasn't building legacy. She was solving problems. Once a young engineer asked her why she never patented the restrictor. She replied, "You don't patent a life jacket during a flood." As the years passed, others rose through the ranks. She trained many of them, men who would later take credit for systems she'd refined or theories she'd quietly corrected. She didn't mind. She had what mattered: tools, engines, purpose. In 1969, at age 60, Beatrice retired from the RAE. She left behind a 33-year career, 17 critical wartime projects, dozens of peacetime contributions, and a legacy that could be traced not through headlines, but through data, design, and durable machines. She returned home with George. Together, they converted an old barn into a workshop. He built model aircraft. She rebuilt engines. They didn't travel. They didn't lecture. They lived simply, and every so often, when she opened a drawer and found a spare brass washer, she would hold it in her palm, run her thumb across the tiny opening, and remember what it felt like to stand on the edge of history with a life in the balance, and nothing but physics in her defense. Beatrice Shilling closed the workshop door for the last time on a crisp autumn morning in 1969. The Norton sat quietly in the corner, engine cold, chains slack, its roar long since silenced. She had served 33 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, deployed dozens of critical wartime fixes, and yet the world outside carried on almost unknowing. In the quiet of the barn she and George had converted into a home workshop, she felt the tension of years gradually unwind. She was 60, but her mind raced faster than ever. In the years that followed retirement, she did not seek limelight. She did not give interviews. She did not chase headlines. She rebuilt engines, restored motorcycles, sat in the grease-smudged garage with a cup of tea, and listened to the hum of memory. Occasionally she'd hold a spare brass washer pulled from her old stock, small, unassuming, and let the light catch the tiny drilled hole as though it weighed more than gold. That washer had saved lives. She'd always known it, not for her glory, but for theirs. Yet history has a terrible habit of forgetting the people who do not shout. Her name, once whispered in hangars and inscribed in pilots' logbooks, gradually faded from public memory. Most museums displayed Spitfires and Hurricanes, stalls of engine parts, battles won, but not the engineer who fixed the flaw that let those planes win. When young visitors asked, "Who fixed the Merlin dive problem?" the answer in many books was vague, attributed to a team, or left out entirely, but there were signs. In 1949 she received the Officer of the Order of the British Empire, recognition from King George VI, an accolade public but quiet. Few celebrated. She accepted the medal, posed for photographs, and went back to her bench next morning. For her, the medal was not the end. The work was. A pub opened in Farnborough years later was named the Tilly Shilling, crude in nickname but sincere in honor. A collection of her racing badges was acquired by the Brooklands Museum. On March 8, 2019, the 110th anniversary of her birth, Waterlooville unveiled a plaque in her memory, her hometown finally acknowledging the engineer they had all but overlooked. Universities named buildings after her, and still, for each tribute, she remained modest. "They can call it whatever they like," she would say. "Just make sure it works." In the lecture halls of mechanical engineering departments, her story began to appear, not always in the main syllabus but in sidebars, in case studies, a small brass washer that turned the tide. Students looked at photographs of a woman in overalls standing before an aircraft engine. Some nodded. Some frowned. Why didn't we hear about her sooner? The lecturers answered, because she preferred to let the engine talk, not herself. One rainy afternoon, a young female engineering student visited Brooklands Museum. She paused before the display case containing the restrictor washer. She touched the glass gently. She read the little placard, "Miss Shilling's Orifice, saved countless RAF pilots in World War II. The student felt something rush through her. Pride, wonder, a quiet surge of purpose. She thought of her own grandmother who had served in a factory during the war. She thought of her own Northwest England home and her own struggle to feel seen in a technical class of mostly young men. She whispered, "Thank you," and walked away with more than facts. She carried belief. In a small ceremony in Murmansk, former Soviet mechanics once called her the Frost Witch, but with smiles, not fear. They remembered how their Spitfires that winter flew again. At a research center in Farnborough, the stairwell was still worn from decades of engineers running to fix crises. And somewhere in that building, the initials, BS, were etched faintly on a machine stand, a silent signature of a woman who changed the machine. A final scene, the Norton motorcycle silent under a dusty cover. Beatrice, now in her workshop, lifts the dust, opens the fuel cap, turns the engine by hand. She feels the cold metal, the tight chain, the memory of wind on her helmet, the roar she once heard on Brooklands, and the roar she prevented in the skies. She stands, looks out the open barn door to the country lane beyond. The shadow of the bike stretches long in the amber afternoon. The sky is quiet, engines aren't revving, but somewhere, maybe 50 years earlier, they soared. She smiled faintly. She had lived not for flash, not for applause, but for the moment when failure stopped. When a pilot pulled out of a dive and kept going. When a machine trusted its operator. When a country's defense worked because someone believed that small could be powerful. As the sun began to set, she placed the brass washer gently into a wooden box she kept for old parts. She closed it, locked it, and turned off the workshop lights. Outside, the wind sighed over the roofs, and somewhere a Spitfire roared quietly in memory. That night, in her dreams, she heard the Merlin engine humming, not dying. She heard the propeller blur and the pilot's laughter. She saw parachutes folded tight, safe landings, distant cheers. She awoke with the faint smell of oil and fuel, smiled, got up, went to her bench, adjusted a spanner. Because, even in retirement, the work continued, because she never stopped fixing things. Beatrice Shilling's legacy is not just the washer, not just the planes, not just the medals. It's the sense that one person, one idea, executed at the right time, can shift history. She gave engineers, women, mechanics, pilots, permission to believe in the simple, to challenge the complex, to trust the machine and the person behind it. And now when you look at a Merlin engine, a Hurricane dive, or a Norton motorcycle lean into a turn, remember, someone engineered not only the mechanics, but the possibility of victory.